All three adaptations of Richard Matheson's iconic vampire novel I Am Legend share a fatal flaw: their ending. All three change the ending that Matheson wrote, and while the changes may seem minor, they serve to completely destroy the point the book was making. Obviously, spoilers for both the book and its three adaptations will be discussed in this video, and I Am Omega from 2007 has been excluded because it was riffing on the success of the Will Smith-led adaptation and wasn't ever really trying to adapt the book. I Am Legend was published in 1954, but the idea first came to Matheson years earlier when he saw Bela Lugosi in Dracula as a teenager.
And at that time, even as a teenager, the thought occurred to me, if one vampire is scary, what if the whole world were full of vampires? It took me at least 10 years before I put that into action.
I Am Legend follows Robert Neville, the last man standing in a world overrun by vampires. By day, he fortifies his house, kills sleeping vampires, and attempts to figure out the science behind the disease. By night, he drinks to numb his loneliness and to drown out the voices of the vampires who besiege his home. He learns that there are two types of vampires. The first kind are essentially feral creatures, but the second kind, created by mutation of the disease, have formed a civilized society. Despite making some progress, he's having a pretty bad time of it, and there's even a heartbreaking incident involving a dog. But then one day, he comes across another survivor, a woman called Ruth. Only it turns out she's actually a vampire who's been sent to trap him. Once Neville has been captured and is awaiting execution, he looks out over the crowd of vampires and realises that he's the abnormal one. Normalcy was a majority concept, the standard of many and not the standard of just one man. He then realises that they're all terrified of him. To this vampire society, he's the legendary monster that has been ruthlessly killing, hence the book's name and last line, I Am Legend. We haven't been following the hero of the story, we've been following the monster. In his dying moments, he accepts that there's no place for him anymore, and that the world belongs to the vampires now. This is amusing to him even in his pain, and he describes it as full circle. Okay, now on to the adaptations. First up, we've got The Last Man on Earth in 1964. Matheson actually co-wrote the screenplay for this adaptation, but he thought that horror legend Vincent Price was miscast as Neville, who in this version is renamed Morgan, and that the direction was kind of poor. He ended up disliking the movie so much that he used the pseudonym Logan Swanson in the credits to avoid being associated with it. Whether or not the movie is any good is up for debate, but in terms of being an adaptation, it's not great. When Morgan realises that Ruth is a vampire, he gives her a transfusion of his immune blood, and she's instantly cured. If only curing diseases were that simple in real life. In the book, Neville says he'll do anything he can to cure her, but he hasn't actually had any success in developing a vaccine. The situation is basically hopeless, but in the movie, Morgan optimistically plans to cure everyone of vampirism. Just then, Ruth's people attack. They corner Morgan in a church, and it's there, while dying of his wounds, that he realises that they see him as a monster.
You freaks! All of you. All of you freaks! Mutations! You're freaks! I'm a man. The last man. They were afraid of me. They were afraid of me. They were afraid of me. I didn't know.
This ending loses points because of Morgan still believing that they're freaks. He isn't acceptant of vampires being the next iteration of humanity in the way that Neville is in the book. This is crucial to what makes the ending so impactful. Neville reaches a moment of true self-awareness, whereas Morgan never does. The Last Man on Earth definitely tries, but it doesn't manage to capture the heart of the book. Next up, we've got The Omega Man in 1971, which Matheson described as ludicrous and so removed from my book that it didn't even bother me. He's right that it's absolutely nothing like the book, but it's also probably the most fun adaptation of the three. Charlton Heston plays Neville in this version, and instead of vampires, we've got mutants who are sensitive to light, so they wear black robes and shades all of the time, which looks hilariously ridiculous. They form a cult called the Family, and they're intent on murdering Neville. Joyce Corrington, one of the film's co-writers, spoke about why they made these changes.
But it was all about vampires, and it just didn't feel right to do vampires. So I have a PhD in chemistry, so germ warfare, chemical warfare, this was 30 years ago, but it was on my mind as a way you could wipe out civilization, so we used that theme instead of vampires.
The plague being caused by bioweapons also led to the infected hating science and technology, which as you might expect puts them at a real disadvantage when faced with the gun-wielding Neville. But they do manage to eventually catch him, and he's put on trial, during which a couple of lines of dialogue vaguely gesture towards the book.
He is part of the dead. He is obsolete. You are discarded. You are the refuse of the past. You're full of crap.
Obviously, this completely misses the point of Matheson's novel, though. Neville is supposed to have the realisation that he's the out-of-place big bad Dracula of this world, but Heston's Neville outright denies this fact. Much like The Last Man on Earth, this movie also has Neville develop a cure. In his dying moments, he gives the serum made from his blood to a group comprised mostly of children, suggesting that the human race has been saved. But unlike The Last Man on Earth, it feels like the Omega Man was barely even trying to adapt the book anyway. Lastly is the best known and most financially successful adaptation, 2007's I Am Legend. Like its direct predecessor, this film also has an aversion to vampires, and instead offers up Darkseekers, which are albino mutant creatures created via a genetically engineered cancer cure gone wrong. In a 2011 interview, Matheson said that it was so well done that I had to go along with it, though I had to realise that, once again, they were not following my book, adding, "I don't know why they keep buying my books. They might as well have written something entirely new." That excellent last point aside, calling the film well done is definitely a matter of opinion. While Will Smith's performance is generally praised, the CGI Darkseekers are generally hated, but points have to be given for expanding the role of the dog. Sam is a very good girl. But once again, this adaptation struggles with the ending, of which there are two versions. In the cinematic ending, Neville creates a cure, again, and dies in a fiery blast so that his friends can escape. We then see them find a compound of other human survivors, and they hand over the cure. Then we get a voiceover from Anna eulogising Neville.
On September 9th, 2012, at approximately 8:49 p.m., he discovered that cure, and at 8:52, he gave his life to defend it. We are his legacy. This is his legend.
This is basically spitting in the face of the book's ending, but director Francis Lawrence originally shot an ending that was closer to the book, with Neville failing to develop a cure and realising that the Darkseekers aren't mindless monsters, and so he feels remorse for experimenting on them. This is often reported as being completely true to the book, but while it's good that he has the moment of realisation that he is the monstrous legend, the sting is taken right out of the tale by what happens next. Instead of dying, Neville drives off into the sunset, not literally, to find other human survivors.
Keep your radio on. Listen for our broadcasts. You are not alone.
The point of the book is that Earth belongs to the vampires now, and there's no place for humans. Suggesting that humans might coexist with vampires just lessens the punch. Lawrence personally preferred this ending, saying, "I agree it's the better ending. I mean, it's the more philosophical version of the end. But in terms of story math, we're doing everything you're not supposed to do, right? The hero doesn't find the cure, right? They drive off into the unknown, and the creatures who you've been saying are the bad ones the whole time you learn actually have humanity, and aren't the bad ones. The hero's the bad one. And so you've basically turned everything on its head. We tested it twice, and it got wildly rejected." It is a shame that test audiences hated this ending, but it's also a shame that it didn't fully commit to the darkness of the book anyway. There's currently a sequel in the works, which according to the film's writer Avika Goldsman will trace back to the original Matheson book, an alternate ending as opposed to the released ending in the original film. What Matheson was talking about was that man's time on the planet as the dominant species had come to an end. That's a really interesting thing we're going to get to explore. There will be a little more fidelity to the original text. But the book begins with man not being the dominant species, and it ends with man completely dying out. This film just feels like another Hollywood cash grab, instead of being made with any care for the book. In Matheson's opinion, the most accurate adaptation of his book is actually George A. Romero's 1968 zombie film, Night of the Living Dead.
The closest anyone ever came was George Romero in Night of the Living Dead. I've had a lot of people say, inspired by or an homage to, and that doesn't put any money in my pocket.
Matheson isn't just grasping at straws here. Romero himself has confirmed this.
I guess the original idea for Night of the Living Dead was basically inspired by a novel, a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. Richard actually jokes with me about saying that I stole his idea. And I keep saying, no, my guys aren't vampires. They certainly aren't vampires. They're not even zombies. Zombies, to me, were, those boys in the Caribbean. I thought I was creating a completely new monster. The neighbors suddenly turned into flesh eaters, ghouls.
Yes, it's zombies, or in Romero's words, ghouls, and not vampires, but we need to remember the context. Night of the Living Dead was made before zombie outbreak movies were everywhere, so the idea of undead humanoid monsters overrunning the country was far more unique. Plus, the vampires from The Last Man on Earth actually resemble zombies rather than vampires, what with their shuffling. Still, it's clearly not an actual adaptation. There are pros and cons to the 3 I Am Legend movies, but in terms of being adaptations, the real killer, the stake through the heart, is their endings. All 3 misunderstand what makes the book's ending so powerful, and in my eyes, that dooms them. Adaptations don't have to strictly adhere to the source material. In fact, they often shouldn't, because books and movies are different mediums that require different things. But the 3 endings that we get from I Am Legend's adaptations feel like cop-outs. If, or more likely when, a 4th adaptation of I Am Legend hits screens, hopefully the filmmakers will dare to give audiences the dark ending that the story not only deserves, but needs.